Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friend, Philip Thomas. Hi, Philip.
Hello.
Philip and I are in a new series in 1 Timothy, and today we're going to be discussing widows. Now, many of us know widows. Some of us may be widows or widowers, but specifically widows is what Paul is going to write about today. And we're going to see how Paul tells young Pastor Timothy how to minister to and minister with widows. So stay with us. Welcome back to Bible Study with Friends. We're going to be picking up in the 5th chapter from verse 1 down to chapter 6, verse 21, almost the end of the book. Is going to be on a section about conduct in the church. So this is Timothy's pastorate in Ephesus, and this is Paul, his friend and mentor, giving the young disciple advice on how to be a good pastor, how to be a good leader, how to be a good spiritual example. And now we're going to talk about conduct in the fellowship of the church. And we're going to start at chapter 5, verse 1. The very beginning of this section, before he starts talking about widows, he has one verse, really, where he's talking about people of all ages, and especially older people of all ages, okay, of both sexes. This is in light of, if we remember verse 12, where it said up here in chapter 4, verse 12, let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather the speech, conduct, love, faith, purity, show yourself to be an example to those who believe, no matter what age they are, right? Remember that?
Yes.
We talked about that last week.
Yeah.
Well, now, in light of not allowing them to give you a hard time about being young, this is how you should act towards older people. It says, do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers. Now, so the first thing he talks about coming out of the chute is don't rebuke an older man. Now, in the context, why would Timothy have a tendency to want to rebuke an older man in light of that verse we just read?
Because they're looking down. Well, there's a possibility they're looking down on him because of his age.
So if an older man comes in and says, you're just a snot-nosed kid, what do you know? Be careful as the spiritual leader of the church, pastor who's got guys in the church older than him.
Yeah.
Be careful not to fall into this trap of trying to rebuke him and say, don't talk to me that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So the command is don't sharply rebuke. Now, the word rebuke in Greek means to slap down. Mm-hmm. So it says, don't slap down an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father. Say, I really appreciate your wisdom, your age. I want to respect that. I would love your input. I'm open to it. Yeah. See what I'm saying? You're not, and that's verse 12. You're showing by example your love, your concern, and you're including them, not slapping them down. And then it goes on to the younger men as brothers. Another treat him, appeal to him as brothers. And the word appeal means to exhort. That means that, remember that word exhort means to come alongside and nudge.
Yeah.
So we want to do an appeal to them and kind of nudge them in our direction as a father. I'd appreciate your input. I would respect your input. And for a younger Christian, I would treat them as a brother. And I would exhort them, I would appeal to them as a brother. So be inclusive, not exclusive. Don't be dominating, but treat these people differently. And then it goes in, older women, appeal to them as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. In other words, you appeal to them, you talk to them in purity. You talk to them wholesomely. You don't flirt. You don't do things that are inappropriate. These are the pastor's roles for these people. Now, what do you notice? We got older men, we got younger men, we got older women, and we got younger women. And there's this command in chapter 5, verse 1 and verse 2. Pastor, you can't treat all ages the same. You need to treat older men as a father and respect them as a father. You have to treat younger guys as a brother. You have to treat older women as a mother, and younger women as a sister. So you can't have a ministry to all people and think it's homogenous, that it's one ministry to everybody.
Yeah.
You have to treat people where they are. And then in verse 3, he switches and really talks about this next section. And this is honoring widows who are widows indeed. What's the question that would immediately come up if you read that? Honor widows who are widows indeed.
People who are women in particular who are, well, it says widows, so
widows,
women in particular who have lost spouses.
Okay. And it says to honor them, right?
Yep.
Okay. Now, the word honor, if we go to chapter 6, we talk about you have elders and leaders in the church. They are worthy of double honor. And in the context of there, honor means financial support.
Okay.
All right. So here he said, help honor widows. And then he describes the widows. And what does he say about them? He says, honor widows who are what?
Widows indeed.
So what's the question? What would be a question you want to ask yourself?
Who are these widows?
Yeah. Well, what makes a widow indeed or a widow not indeed?
Yeah.
If we're supposed to honor widows, and honor means to help them, even financially help them.
Yeah.
Who are widows indeed? How do we decide who's a widow indeed and who isn't a widow indeed?
Okay.
You get that?
Yeah.
So it'd be like in English saying honor and support, help support women who are really, truly widows.
Got you.
So you'd say, wait a minute. Well, you can be a widow, but not truly be a widow. So we're going to talk about that. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to define a widow indeed. And he goes into, in verse 4, where you were going earlier, if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family. Now, who's the they? If any widow has children or grandchildren, they must learn.
The children and the grandchildren?
Yeah, because if it was talking about her, that's a single. So if it was any widow who has children or grandchildren, she must first learn to practice. But it's not. It's if a widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now, this is a great verse, Philip, for a biblical mandate for kids to help their parents in their old age. You read that verse, if any widow has children or grandchildren, the children and grandchildren need to please God by practicing some piety towards their parents and to make sure there's some return to their parents, that they actually help their parents. This is acceptable in the sight of God. So if you're wondering, gee, mom is getting to a point of needing to go into a home or needing some assistance, do I have to pay? Yeah, you do. If you're capable of helping, you need to help. That is acceptable to God.
But
now,
I don't remember
what comment?
Yeah, I just didn't remember what piety meant. I don't remember what that means.
Well, with piety means with reverence.
Reverence. Okay.
Okay. You need You need to treat your parents with the respect they're due, the reverence they're due for all they've done for you.
Gotcha.
By helping them out. You can't just write them off and say, well, I got my own problems. I got big screen TVs to pay for. I can't help my parents.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Give them some return for all they've done for you, the years of nose wiping and diaper changing, right?
Yeah.
Now, she who is a widow indeed and who has been left alone, now all of a sudden, he's talking about now a widow indeed is not a widow who has children and grandchildren, because the widow who has children and grandchildren, the children and grandchildren should be helping her.
Based on that, yeah.
Based upon that. But a woman who is a widow indeed, who has been left alone, she has no family.
Makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
Has fixed her hope on God and continues to with entreaties and prayers night and day. So all she's got is the Lord in the context of the church. And so she's got her eyes fixed on the Lord and she has no other help.
Right.
But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. He's talking about her actions. There are widows who say, I'm not married anymore, and for the last few years of my life, I'm just going to party. And they go kind of crazy. They become even sexually loose. I mean, they can go off the rails, all right? Spiritually off the rails. A widow can quit going to church. They can give themselves over to dead acts.
Okay.
So she can act dead even though she's still alive. She can have these dead actions because she's given herself over just to feel alive. She's given herself over to wanton pleasures. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So she's not a widow indeed. She may be alone, but she's not dependent upon God. She's off the rails.
Yeah.
All right.
She just
then he goes in verse 7, prescribe these things as well so that they may be above reproach. These things are fixing her hope on God and continuing in entreaties, pray day and night. And he goes, prescribe these things that she's doing as well. So prescribe these things regarding these widows as well, so that they may be above reproach. In other words, don't force a widow who is a widow indeed and all by herself, depending upon God, to do things just to survive that are not edifying, that are not God glorifying. Don't force her to do that by not assisting her. And he says, and then he goes on, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That relates all the way back up here to verse 4, right? If anyone does not provide for his own, he's an infidel. He's worse than an infidel. So if you're wondering, should I help my mom or my dad in their old age? The answer is absolutely yes. It's, number one, acceptable to God. Number two, if you don't, you are acting poorly.
Yeah.
Those are great verses for us who have parents that we've had to deal with and put in nursing homes and take care of medically and those kinds of things. And then it goes, a widow is to be put on the list. Now that's interesting. That's the first time we've heard that term. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man. That's basically a one-woman man. She hasn't been sleeping around. Mm-hmm. That's the same terminology that he uses for an elder, a one-woman man. It's not that she's been married once and widowed perhaps, or divorced and then married again. She's married to one man at a time, okay? She's faithful to one man. She should be put on the list if she is over 60 and has been faithful in her marriage, having a good reputation of good works, if she has brought up children, if she has shown how, now this is, maybe she's got no kids, but this idea of a widow indeed is somebody who's brought up children and the children are gone. Maybe the children are in another country. Maybe the children have even died by now. This makes them a widow indeed because they're alone. And he goes, she has shown hospitality to strangers. One of the ministries of a wife is showing hospitality in the home. If she has washed the saints' feet. Now, how would that relate today in verse 10? She has washed the saints' feet. How could you say a woman has washed the saints' feet?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, when Jesus washed their feet, the apostles' feet, remember what he said? He said, I am the master, but I am willing to serve you.
Okay.
Right? So this is a term that the church would recognize as a term of humble service.
Okay.
So this is a woman who's active in the church. She has had a good household. She's been faithful to her husband while the husband was still alive. She has been thinking about God and praying and depending upon God. And he says, put her on the list. Now that's a very interesting term. I did some research on that. And apparently in the first century church, especially in Ephesus, because they had a lot of widows. Now, why would they have a lot of Christian widows?
Because they were Christians being persecuted?
Right. The husbands were being killed for the faith. So all of a sudden, Nero was starting his dedicated persecution by this point.
Okay.
And ultimately, that same persecution was going to kill Paul. This is one of his last letters. First and Second Timothy and Titus are his last letters before his death. So we have here, because of persecution, a ton of widows. So it's important that the pastor knows how to handle widows, right? And he goes, a widow indeed that should be put on the list. And the list was a list of women who were basically paid staff members. This was a list of women who would be honored, who would be compensated. And it's going to talk more about that in a second. So he goes, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work, in other words, a great Christian life, she's served, she's been a good wife, she's had a home, she's been involved in the church, she's served the saints in the church, you should put her on the list.
Yeah.
But refuse to put younger women on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation. Now, getting married is not a condemnation in itself. In fact, he tells them they should get married. But taking money for being a widow indeed and then getting married and taking that money is a condemnation. It's cheating.
Okay.
All right. Because they have set aside their previous pledge, and that pledge is to Christ's service. Now, this is one of the early places where the Catholic Church got this idea of women who gave a pledge to serve Christ. Now, this whole Catholic thing about being a bride of Christ and all that stuff, that's all Catholic, but it's not biblical. But here is this idea that in the first century church, way before, centuries before the Catholic Church was created, there were women who were widows indeed, by definition. They were alone. They had no other support. They didn't have families to support them. If they did have families to support them, the family needed to support them and not the church. But if they were widows indeed, they needed to be on the list. And younger women who were still of marriageable age shouldn't be on the list because that violated the conditions of the list. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, at the same time, they also learned to be idle. Now, this is talking about the younger widows who you are supporting. You're basically, these are younger women, widows, and they learn because they don't have to work. You're providing for them. They learn to be idle. Now, these are women who could remarry, who could work and provide for themselves. They don't. And the church, if the church steps in and starts to provide for them, that is reinforcing this idea of I don't need to work. Remember in First Thessalonians when Paul said if he doesn't work, he shouldn't eat.
Yes.
Okay, that's a kind of a truism. And here it says these younger women that you are starting to support, you're not helping them. In fact, you're teaching them to be idle, to go around from house to house, not merely be idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Now, this is a little message between the lines to women to be careful about not being a busybody, not being a gossip, not going from house to house talking to other women about other women or about other men, for that matter, and being gossip. Therefore, he goes, because younger widows should not be on the list, because it's not good for them to be on the list. In verse 14, therefore, I want younger widows to be married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach to her. In other words, she should function as a wife. She should get remarried. Now, we have a case of that with Ruth. You remember Ruth?
I do, yeah.
She was a widow, and she remarried Boaz, and she was a widow who worked in the fields, taking care of herself, but God arranged it for Boaz to be her quote savior, married her, and she became part of the lineage of Christ. So in the lineage of Christ, he has a Gentile widow who was embraced by the family of God and be great grandmother of Jesus. So it goes, I want younger women to get married, bear children, keep house, give the enemy no excuse, no occasion for reproach, because she's living a godly wife role, because she is marriageable. Again, she's not over 60. And then he says, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. Some widows, and that's talking about that same ones that for the sake of feeling alive, for the sake of the last few years of release, they go nuts and they go off the rails, and they really follow satanic, unbiblical, unholy actions in their lives. And they have gone after, they've turned aside to follow Satan. Now, verse 16, we're going to end up with this last verse. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. So if you've got family, in that family there are other widows, the widows need to band together and support each other. They are not widows indeed because they have other people. And that's what Ruth and Miriam were doing. Ruth would go out into the fields and glean the leftovers from the field, bring it home, share it with Miriam.
It's pretty neat.
There's a biblical example of this. So the church, he's basically saying, Pastor, you got to take care of the people, the widows in your church who are truly widows, who have no other help. Take care of them. The younger widows who have the ability to get married again, they should get married. They should live, they should have a new family. Nothing wrong with that. Now, they could also, if they had means, other means, perhaps they were widows of a rich husband or something, they could go back to the single ministry it talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where it says the singles can focus on serving the Lord. If they can do that, fine. But if they need help, they shouldn't depend upon the church to help them financially if they are able to remarry and be helped by other people or helped by their families. Clarify?
Yeah.
very practical. And it says any woman who's a believer, they should assist each other. They must, obviously, if they say they must help each other, obviously one of them is able to help the other. They can work as a team and help each other. And it says, and it goes here, they must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows in need. In other words, don't try to take money from the church if you're a widow who has other means available, including remarrying. Nothing wrong with remarrying late in life. Nothing wrong with a widow marrying a widower, or a man that's never been married, or another believer who's interested in being married to her. Nothing wrong with that at all. It's biblical. But we shouldn't take money from the church if we don't fall into the category of deserving that.
Yeah.
And being a widow indeed. And that's how we should address our widows in the church. And I know at church benevolence, one of the priorities in many, many church benevolences, and your church, and I know in my old church, there was a special benevolence for widows who did not have the capacity to help themselves.
Okay.
There were people that went out, cut their yard, they did all kinds of things, paint their houses sometimes, do all kinds of repairs just to help ministries in obeying this. Now, the list might look differently, but it's basically a list of women who are widows indeed, who need help. And you support them for the condition that then they can minister to other widows in the church. They can literally have a ministry. So the idea of ministering to widows is one thing, but ministering with widows can have a definite ministry in the lives of other widows. I have a friend who is a recent widower that her husband died of cancer, and she was torn up. They'd been married a long time. And a widow from another church, as a matter of fact, but a widow reached out to her and said, can we spend some time together and just encourage each other?
Wow.
And that's the ministry of a widow indeed to a widow indeed.
Wow. That's incredible.
And it really is incredible how practical Paul is being to a young Timothy, saying, you know, you're a young guy, you may never have dealt with this many widows, but you got to pay attention here. Yeah. And it was a big church, but you got to pay attention to who you're supporting and who needs that support and who really doesn't needs that support. And supporting them may not be doing them a favor. And there's some real principles for us. There's principles for us who are the kids of widows.
Yeah.
And there are principles for the church who has widows in its midst. And I hope that we can learn from this, meditate on it, and take it to the bank and start to use it in our ministries within the context of our own churches. Yeah. Any comments summing up for us?
I mean, I don't think I've ever seen how like widows, even after losing a spouse, still have like a ministry. So that was cool to see. That was great.
And you know, I can name some widows at your church who are very active in the lives of other widows. And one of the things is they watch for a woman who just loses her husband.
Okay.
And boy, what a ministry that is to have a woman who walks in and says,
absolutely,
you know, I understand and I feel with you, and let me pray with you, let me love you, let me keep you focused on the Lord. Yeah. Women need that, and men need that too. But this is specifically about women. Men have the capacity to go get another job if they want to, or whatever, especially in that culture that Paul is writing on. So I really am blessed with the idea that Paul is being very detailed and very practical in his commands here to his young disciples. And I hope this has been a blessing to you guys and that you were blessed. Please subscribe, like us, and that helps us with the algorithm. And comment. I'd love to hear your comments, maybe about your mom, maybe about things you've seen in your church of widows ministering to other widows, or how your church is ministering to widows indeed. And we can go from those comments and be blessed together as a community. And God bless you guys. We will see you next week.